He was a morbidly obese surgeon destined for an operating table and an early death. Now he's a rebel MD who is fabulously fit and fighting to make America healthy again. This is Stay Off My Operating Table with Dr. Philip Ovadia.
Oh, hey, folks. You found the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia, and I can say without fear of being corrected that the guest on today's show has written a book with the most interesting name, the book itself, not the person, of any book title that I'm screwing this all up, Phil. Just take it from here.
Yeah, I think what you were trying to say is we got a great one coming up, and Brendan Reid has written a great book. He's coming to us from basically the other side of the world in New Zealand, down under and around, but really excited. The book that he's written is titled The Fat Ginger Nerd. And I love the title as well. It certainly, I think, serves the purpose of a book title and grabbing your attention. And we'll get into all about that book. But before we get there, Brendan, why don't you give a little bit of the backstory to the book and just maybe tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what maybe how that because I know you use that sort of moniker on social media, how that came to be.
Sure. Firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today. The story of the book, The Fat Ginger Nerd, the name specifically, so I named it after the three things basically that I used to get the most grief for while I was growing up, going all the way back to school. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I'm in my mid-40s now, so it was the 80s and 90s that I was growing up. And in those days, there weren't so many kids of size as perhaps we might see nowadays. And so for that reason, perhaps I was the subject of a disproportionate amount of unwanted attention, shall we say, regarding my disproportions, I suppose. So I got a lot of fat names, all sorts of variations under the sun you can think to imagine. I probably heard it. I wasn't so much, some kids get beaten up a bit when they're at school, that sort of thing. Thankfully, I didn't get any of that. It was never really physical. It was just words. But when you say just, I mean, there were a lot of words. And when you hear these things over and over again and you get put down over and over, that you're lazy and you're stupid and you're worthless because you're not able to do what seems to come so easily, so naturally to everybody else, that you start to absorb some of that. It starts to sink in and you begin to accept it to a degree. And the flow-on effect of my size was that I was a bit of a recluse, if you like, very introverted growing up, still am now to a point. The hair color was just one of those things that compared to the other two was just that's not so bad. I got a bit of that, the carrot top and everything else, even though carrot tops are green. But yeah, so the nerd was kind of a byproduct perhaps of the size. And I thought, you know what, let's just take ownership of these things. It essentially sums up in 3 words, the old me, the story of my life up until the age of about 36, 37 years of age. Up until then, that's what everybody would have thought of me as. Who's that Brendan guy? Did you know him? Oh, yeah, he was that fat ginger nerd I knew at school or whoever, So I thought, let's just take ownership of that. Yeah, that's who I was. That's who everybody knew me as. Of course, the fat part is history now, no longer. And of course, the book itself is primarily about the before, the during, and the after around that weight loss journey.
Great.
I'm looking at your website, and I've always been, as someone who really hasn't ever struggled with weight, I've wondered what it's like. There's a photo here, a before and after photo you've got on your website. The website, by the way, folks, is called thefatgingernerd.com. And you're standing inside a pair of your old pants.
Yeah.
You're in one leg of an old pair of pants.
That's right.
What is it like to experience that level of success? That must just be.
Yeah, it was something that I never dreamed would happen. You reach a point where you decide that because I was never happy the way I was, right? Like I always wanted to do the right thing, follow the advice, eat less, move more, food pyramids, and all those sorts of things. They didn't work, but I was the one who always got the blame for it not working. So my self-confidence is practically non-existent for a great many years. And yeah, in that photo,
I want to slow down right there.
yeah,
This is so important. And we hear this a lot. And on our show, we go back and forth between super nerdy doctor types like Phil and people like me who aren't. And what you just said about you did all the right things and it didn't work for you and
mm,
it shredded your confidence.
yeah,
I'd love to not just blow past that. We may not need to spend a lot of time on it, but you got into that because I asked you about standing inside one leg of your pants.
mm. And this was, and the fact that I was able to eventually do that, like it boggles my mind as much as it might boggle anybody else's that I was able to do that. Those dress pants that you see me standing in there, they had a waist size of 132 centimeters. I couldn't translate that straight away in inches. We're the metric system over here. But even then, like that measurement was the measurement of the pants. It wasn't really my true waist because my belly was bulging so much, as anyone of size will know, that you kind of have to wear the pants perhaps a little lower than you might otherwise would to allow the bulge, the balloon, if you like, to hang out over the front. So my true waist circumference would have actually been a great deal more than that. And in the end, I lost something like about 45 centimeters or so from the waist, which is what about
Close to it's close to 20 inches. Yeah.
yeah, 16, 18 inches from my waist. Yeah, to be able to get both legs in there, that was really kind of an end point that I wasn't sure I was ever capable of achieving. You know, one of the things that I found really difficult to work my brain around as I was actually losing the weight was goal setting and visualizing just what I might end up looking like, what I could become, who I could be, because I'd been this way my whole life. So I had no real frame of reference about, what I could visualize and see for myself. So I really had no idea of where I was going or if I was going anywhere at all. So it's really quite the capstone, if you like, to top off the whole story that I was ultimately able to fit into those pants that I really, presumed would have been what I've been wearing or something like that for the rest of my life.
So what was going on I'm sorry, Phil, I'm fascinated by this. What was going on in your mind about Brendan Reid when it started working? What happened in your head, in your self-image, in your image of yourself in the future, whatever that was? What was happening as it started to work rather than fail and fail?
I guess before I can answer that, I can just sort of make the point that when I began this change of diet, I took up this low carb diet. One of the reasons I hadn't tried low carb any sooner is because of the pervasive negative reputation that the diet has had in wider circles for such a long time. The policy, at least in New Zealand, has always been such that whatever you do to lose weight, do not do low carb. And so it was right at the bottom of my list of dietary options for that very reason. I wanted to believe that, the experts were right. Otherwise, why do we call them experts? And to shoulder the blame that everybody had been foisting upon me my whole life, that I was the way I was because it was all my own fault. And so when I began low carbing, I went into it without any real faith that it would work. It was simply a case of me reaching down through the options. I tried these other options, tried all the official advice, that hasn't worked. Surely anything unofficial that isn't sanctioned or recommended or endorsed or anything like that, surely this isn't going to do it. But, I recognized that I had to give it a try, because if I didn't, then I wouldn't honestly be able to say to myself or to anyone else that I had tried everything, as a lot of people say. So I went into it not really convinced that it would do anything for me. And so getting back to your question around, what was the thought process as it started to work? I remember one of the first things I was thinking was that this was just a coincidence. This could just be anything. This, people could lose weight for whatever reason. It was such a struggle to come to terms with the fact that I was actually seeing what was playing out before me on the scales in terms of, being able to fit clothes better. And after a few months, having to start shopping around for smaller clothes for the first time in my life. It was such a massive mental hurdle that took some time to accommodate and to come to terms with, that this is just completely upending my sense of reality. And I was sort of struggling, like I said before, to visualize where I might end up. But I recognize that, whatever's happening, whether it's the diet or not, I just want to keep going with whatever it is that I'm doing and just ride this wave, if you like, and see how long it lasts, see where it takes me, see where I go, see where I end up.
Yeah, it's so interesting and kind of thinking about this from both sides, right? The perspective of the system, we'll call it, when there are failures, when it's not working, and the perception of the individuals for whom it's not working. And I do find it so interesting. And of course, I was in the same boat as you, maybe from a little bit of a different perspective, because I was both sort of part of the system and someone being sort of failed by the systemic advice. But same thing, I always blamed myself first. And I think the system tends to put that blame on people. The reason that, we're not seeing the expected outcomes from this advice we're giving is because people aren't listening. And it's very hard, to get the system to think about maybe the advice is wrong. And as an individual, right, it's also very hard, like you said, to say maybe the experts are wrong, right? Obviously, you eventually kind of prove that to yourself. I do want to get a little bit of your perspective, though, because you're in New Zealand, right? And a lot of times we kind of think about this whole crisis, the metabolic health crisis, as a largely American problem or an American first problem. But talk about, what it was like for you growing up in New Zealand, 80s and 90s, right? This is, here in the US, right? That's when this was really coming to a head. The US dietary guidelines get released in 1980 for the first time. The obesity, heart disease, metabolic diabetes, all these problems were kind of exploding during that time. And what was your experience like around this in New Zealand? Were you kind of hearing the same dietary guidelines? And what was the food environment like, maybe comparing to what you know about the US at the time?
Sure. The food environment is perhaps slightly different in New Zealand in that we're able to grow a lot of our own food. We're a food producer, a food exporter. We have a very big farming and agriculture, and also meat and dairy.
And may I say, your lamb is fantastic. I have it all the time.
Well,
second that.
You're welcome. I love it too.
Thank you very much.
I have a lamb chop. I have a plate of lamb chops once a week as part of my meal rotation. Now, the food quality in that regard has always been relatively good here in New Zealand, and certainly we produce a surplus. We're a population of 3 million then. We're about 5 million now. So the food in that regard was always pretty good. And in terms of the food that I ate while growing up, it was those sorts of things, the meat and veg for dinner. It would be the cereals for breakfast and the sandwiches and whatever for lunch. These things were the same sorts of things that other family members ate. These were the same things that other people around me ate. So I didn't really sort of see myself as following or not following the advice any better or worse than anybody else. It was a real mystery to me deep down as a youngster. What am I doing that's so different, that's resulting in my appearance being so different? The advice itself in New Zealand, I didn't really become familiar with until about 1991, I think it was, at the age of about 12. I was the subject of a dietary intervention, you might say. I was hauled away to the local hospital and introduced to the local dietitian in her office there. And this was not my idea, but at the same time, I'm thinking, this person's supposed to know what they're doing, so let's listen to what she has to say. And she starts selling me on this great big poster on her wall. I remember this very well, as being like my new best friend in the entire world. And it was a poster of a diagram called the Healthy Food Pyramid. And it turned out, I discovered this later while I was researching for the book, this pyramid was basically an adaptation of what had been published in Australia a few years earlier in the late 80s. And so here we are in the early 90s. In 1991, the New Zealand's Department of Health, as they were known then, the Ministry of Health now, they just published a document that year. So it was brand new at the time when I was introduced to the dietitian, called Food for Health. And to my understanding, this is the document that sort of served as New Zealand's first equivalent, if you like, of actual dietary guideline recommendations in this country. And so I'm sort of sitting there as a child wanting to absorb and listen to the experts, be a good boy, do as I'm told, all those sorts of things. And I even asked her for a bit of extra on top of what the dietitian was telling me, saying, well, you got to follow this food pyramid. You see fat's right up at the top. You know, you got to minimize that. You are what you eat, as they say. So if you're fat, that means you're eating too much fat. So you need to go on a low-fat, low-calorie diet, fill up on lots of breads and cereals at the bottom. And I'm taking all this in thinking, yes, okay, this is good. It's not much different from what I'm doing anyway. And I noticed that she was referring to this Food for Health document. Again, I have a copy of that to read as well, you know, because I'm a bit of a nerd in reading and so on. And I wanted to get the official word, you know, from the New Zealand government itself. Because that was clearly what she was referring to, this new document. And I took it home and it was saying all of the same things that the dietitian was saying. Obesity is a result of excessive energy intake or a lack of expenditure. And children, it mentioned children with, you know, progressive obesity should restrict energy dense foods and move more. It's literally telling people of all ages, including children, to do all of these things that the dietitian and all of the other experts were saying. So when that level of advice is so consistent, going from ground level right up to the very top, you think there's no way this could possibly be wrong. And so I give this a try. Naturally, it doesn't work. If anything, all it did was make me more hungry. And I ended up gaining weight at an even faster rate when I went back to be weighed the next appointment a month or so later. I had gained more weight at a faster rate than what I would have been, you know, when I was just growing naturally before this change. And she was bewildered and utterly confounded by it all. And, there must be something you're not telling us, right? What are you not telling us? What are you cheating? Are you lying or whatever? Straight away, as we sort of mentioned before, the first instinct was not to consider anything about the advice. The advice was, it must be right because that's what everybody else was saying. So it's got to be the patient's fault. And so that was an experience that was not altogether pleasant, shall we say, at that age, 12 or so. And in the end, at that point, I thought after that experience, clearly the official advice is not going to work for me. And the follow-on sort of line of thinking from that was if the best possible advice isn't going to work, then nothing is ever going to work. And that this is just going to be the way I'm always going to be. I'm going to be fat forever. There's nothing anybody can ever do about it. And that was something that I stuck with for way too long. But, you know, at the age I was and in the time that was, there didn't really seem to be any other option.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of an under-recognized consequence of this advice, or just in general. Giving bad advice is worse than giving no advice, right? Because of that sort of demoralizing effect. And, you know, I experienced it myself, right? You're like, I tried it, it didn't work. And, you know, it puts you into that sort of hopeless mindset, right? Because of the best advice coming from the best experts doesn't work, then, you know, like you said, then obviously nothing can work. This must be you know, that's oftentimes when we fall back on, oh, it's your genetics, or, you know, it's basically an incurable, unsolvable problem now. And, you know, you might as well just give up and do what you're going to do. And, you know, and you have to deal with consequences. But it's so interesting to hear, you know, that story, right? And I'm sure you go into this in greater detail in the book, but you essentially ended up unwittingly being the experimental group, right, for New Zealand. These new guidelines come in. Here you are, you know, a young child right at that same time. And so you're introduced to these new guidelines, and, you know, the experiment was sort of being run on you. And the results of the experiment, I think, speak for themselves. And I don't think you're unique in what you experienced around them.
No, that was, it seemed at the time that I was unique because, like I mentioned before, there weren't so many kids of size in those days as there are now. So I was very much the outlier in that time. But, you know, like I say, it was all that we could do. We tried our best with the very official advice. It had come to nothing. That's just the way I'm always going to be. And that was the mindset I took all the way through to adulthood. In terms of how did I sort of get to that point of understanding what, if anything, could be any different? I remember the first time I discovered Atkins was sort of in the early 2000s, like low carb, it periodically does the rounds in the media, right? It sort of pops its head up every now and then the usual gang of experts will come out and knock it down and say, oh no, there's no reason to be doing that. That's crazy. It's dangerous. It's unsubstantiated. There's no evidence. It's a fad, all of those things. It was only about a decade or so after my experience with a dietitian that I had discovered low carb, if you like, for the first time. But again, that the attitude was always, whatever you do to lose weight and get healthy, do not do this one thing. And it wouldn't be for another close to 15 or so years after that I finally made the decision to give it a shot anyway. It was a long time that I was the way I was, the old fat ginger nerd, I suppose, as it were. I guess just sort of coming back to the point of the issue of authorities and people and experts being so quick to blame the patients. I think one of the things that a lot of people in this position struggle to do is they struggle to consider the motivations, if you like, for that person, for the patient who's not doing well. I mean, I know that these motivations might be different for every person, but for me, when I was in that position, I was never happy the way I was. I would have done anything that I was told to do to get better, to be healthy, to not be fat, etc. So I was never short of any, motivation or incentive to do these things. But that was always how it was framed to me, that was exactly the case. Oh, you just need to try harder. You need to be stronger. You need to have more willpower. I just had no willpower, they were saying to me, when all I was just hungry and tired. But they would frame it as being lazy and stupid. That was something that I was never happy with, but I had come to accept it, that, I don't like the way I am. I don't like myself, but this is just the way it's always going to be. And that's just going to be that.
God.
Yeah, amazing to hear. Yeah, let's talk about, so you kind of alluded that you had heard about low carb, and it sounds like the environment in New Zealand around low carb maybe is even more antagonistic. Here in the US, I would say it's more of a matter of it just doesn't get talked about, largely in the mainstream. And it sounds like maybe we're, in New Zealand, it was, it got talked about negatively a lot. It got actively sort of discouraged. Maybe talk about that moment when you did finally say, okay, I've tried everything else. I'm going to start ignoring the advice and give this a try. What was that like?
Yeah. So that came around, that was in 2015. I had started in a last-ditch attempt. I'd given up on diet at that point, and I thought maybe I can exercise my way out of trouble. So I started walking to work and back every day, and it was about 2.5 k's each way. So that's what, 1.5 miles, so about a 3-mile round trip of walking 5 days a week. I did that for about 6 months, and I lost all of about 5 kilos, 10, 11 pounds, which wasn't nothing, but the total weight that I was, it was nothing that anybody was ever going to notice, right? I was a monster then, I'm still a monster now, etc. Then I thought, let's take the next step on the exercise front and go make an appointment at a gym. And for someone in my position, that was really, to me, it felt like just walking to the lion's den. I had nothing but problems and battles and dramas and arguments with the phys ed teachers at school while growing up. They were my mortal enemies as a child. And here's me sort of thinking, let's make an appointment at a gym. This was a big deal in my head. So I snuck in. I didn't tell anyone. This was my big dirty secret that I was just too ashamed to tell anybody about. And the guy, to his credit, he takes one look at me and he says, I don't know that I can do much for you. I think, we could sign you up. You might lose a little bit of weight, but I think what we really need to be looking at first and foremost is your diet. And as soon as he said that, I thought, oh, here we go. But he says, hang on, have a look at this. And he brings up this website promoting what looked to me like the Atkins diet. I remember doing the rounds in the media years ago. This was low carb. There was a website called The Real Meal Revolution. And he says, look at this, you can eat bacon and eggs and lose weight. And I'm thinking, this is a lot like Atkins. I was sort of telling him, it wasn't that discredited all those years ago. And he came back with an argument that I couldn't help but struggle to refute. I thought it was a really good argument. He said, mate, I've been in this position for many years. I've seen a lot of people like you come through my doors, running this gym, looking to lose weight and get healthy. I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have some idea about how to help these people. I've seen this diet work in others who have come to see me, just like you, and I think that this would be a good option for you as well. And this marked for me the first time in my life that an expert, even not necessarily a dietary expert, but a professional all the same. A professional was recommending this diet to me personally, face to face for the first time. And he was staking his professional position on this. So I thought there's got to be something to this if he's willing to stake his reputation on that. But at the same time, I'm sort of coming into conflict with thinking, but all these other experts are saying no. And so I had this yes no argument going on in my head. What do I do? What do I do? And eventually I decided that on the basis of statistical probability, this guy somewhere has to be wrong. He might be meaning well, but he's got to be wrong. But the only way, at the same time, the only way I'm going to know for sure that he is wrong is if I try it. And so that became the motivation. It wasn't because of any belief that it was actually going to do anything. I thought, I'm going to show this guy up for the fraud that he must be, because he's going against the grain, as it were, when it comes to this dietary advice. So that was how I got started, with just at first making the decision to go low carb. It was October. It was a Monday that I made the appointment, and I spent the next few days across that week just sort of thinking and processing it. And I made the decision by the end of that week. I went supermarket shopping the following weekend, later in October. It was one of the longest supermarket shops in my life. I'm starting to do things like looking at food labels and all that technical information on the back of the packet rather than what's on the marketing on the front side. I'm looking at the numbers on the food labels, as I was learning to do at that point. I was still very new to it all. And, me with my nerdy sort of technically minded IT type background, that was how I decided I would approach low carb. I took it very literally. The name suggests don't eat carbs. How do I identify that? I'm looking at the number of carbs on the food labels. And in New Zealand, I don't think this is the case in the US, but in New Zealand and in other parts of the world, it is law here that our food labels must have a column describing the amount of nutrients on the product or in the product per 100 grams of that product. So yes, it tells you all the numbers as a percentage of recommendations, but I knew to ignore those because the recommendations had never worked for me. There was a column for nutrients per serving, but I noticed that the serving sizes were completely subjective, right? They varied from product to product, and one person's serving might be, 2 servings to another person. So that was kind of a bit open to interpretation as well. But what I really liked about the 100 gram column on the labels was that it gave me this objective comparison between any 2 food or drink products across the entire supermarket. So I thought, this is quite easy then. And so I set myself a cut-off limit. I decided I would buy anything and everything I could find that was up to no more than 10 grams of carbs per 100 grams, according to the label. And I would not buy anything more of anything that was over that mark. So I took it very literally, like this is low carb, presumably. And so I found myself coming home from the supermarket with a number of things that I had never, eaten or whatever considered before. A lot of these things I found didn't have labels. They required a bit of an internet search to find these things out. There were things like meat and vegetables that would require a bit of preparation, a bit of cooking. I had to learn to cook. One of the issues I sort of inherited, if you like, as a legacy of having grown up the way I was and having been taught that weight loss is all a matter of energy balance and calories in, calories out, that it doesn't matter what you eat, you just need to be eating less of it. And so what I learned from that, air quotes, was that there was no value to cooking. What was the point in spending my time and wasting my time in the kitchen preparing something when I could just as easily grab something out of the fridge and freezer, chuck it in the microwave, zap it for a few minutes, wolf it down, get on with my life, no dishes, nice and easy. But I'm coming home with these things that require a bit of preparation now for the first time. Whole foods, real foods, things that came from the farm as opposed to the factory, things that our ancestors would recognize as having been alive or having recently been alive or have come from things that were recently alive. All these real whole food concepts that, in a sense, in some ways aren't actually so different from the dietary advice that we all know, the wider advice. But the implication with the wider advice being that it's all about, plant-based this and low-fat that. And here's me coming home armed with, yes, a few more vegetables than before, but primarily I found myself coming home with a lot of different meats, red meat, white meat, seafood, dairy, a few nuts. I'm trying different nuts. I'd never tried nuts until I tried going low carb because I'd always been taught nuts are high fat, therefore nuts are bad. And so there was a lot of this time spent having to understand what low carb was. And in the end, I took this approach with the food labels. And then beyond that, it was learning to cook. There was a bit of time investment going on there as well. But I was still okay with that because I recognized, yeah, there's a bit of time required in this, but this is time investing in myself. I'm clearly not right. I'm clearly not well. I want to be better than I am. It's got to be worth the effort to get right. I wanted to try this low carb thing properly. I didn't want to go into it half-hearted or anything because I wanted to give it an honest shot to be sure one way or another that somebody was wrong. I have these two arguments: low carb will work, no, it won't. Somebody somewhere is wrong. I needed to find out who. So I went into it honestly and seriously and dove into it as best I could.
I'm fascinated. I'm just fascinated. I think about the types of people. When Phil and I first got to know each other, I asked him a lot of questions about what it was like to go through medical school because I had these ideas about, from the outside, it looks to me like, and I realized, Phil actually confirmed for me that in order to succeed in medical school, you have to be somebody who is willing to do what you're told. Phil?
Essentially, yeah. Accept what you're told. Yeah.
I'm not wired that way. I am just not wired that way. And there's positives and negatives to that. And I'm fascinated, Brenda, by your story of what I'm hearing. And this is something I never considered before as being a systemic problem. I've always seen it as an individual problem. A systemic problem, blame the person when the system doesn't work.
Mm.
Now, because of how I'm wired, my mother will tell you as a little kid, I've never taken well to being, just accept it. So I can't relate to that, but I know I'm not normal in that way. It blows my mind to think about people whose fundamental approach to life is to trust the authorities. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, that's how civilizations are maintained.
Sure.
And yet, I personally see it as a form of abuse that you were blamed for what is just horrendously wrong. Not just poor, but diametrically opposite to correct. And you were blamed that it didn't work. And I'm assuming because of maybe how you were raised or how you were wired or I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to be the good boy, right? To do as I'm told, to do the right thing, listen to your elders and
Right.
respect your betters and all that sort of thing. I never set out to be, anti-authoritarian or anything like that. I never misbehaved. I wanted to do whatever I could to get healthy. So I was always looking to be the good boy, etc. And, as the weight falls off, there's a lot of thoughts and feelings and emotions that come bubbling to the surface that, you've been trying much of your life to sort of put behind you previously. And so I found myself with a need to sort of express myself. I mean, there's obviously some excitement. There's some excitement, obviously, that, things are finally working. I seem to have stumbled on a solution for myself here. But at the same time, there's also a bit of frustration and anger about why did this take so long for me to find what ultimately worked? Why is what has so clearly worked for me not more of a thing for others? And I just want to have these conversations with anybody and everybody. But, after a while, I'm starting to wear thin on those around me, friends and family and so on. And I needed that outlet to express myself that I felt I was lacking at that time. And I decided what I needed was an audience that, would understand and relate to everything that I wanted to say about the subject, and B, would never, ever get sick of me talking about it. And I realized that the only person in the world that I could guarantee that would apply to, or both of these things would apply to, was myself. And so that's when I started writing. So I began keeping a journal over the course of my weight loss journey, and that's how the book came about. When I started journaling, it was never with any idea in mind about, well, maybe there'll be a book to show for this one day, because I wasn't necessarily certain that the diet itself was going to work, like I was saying before. So it was really a journey into the unknown. And I started journaling early 2016 as I was underway with it. to just sort of keep track of everything that was going on in my mind so I could leave those around me alone with it. I'm not sort of getting on people's nerves in that regard. I can just keep it to myself, but give myself that outlet to help me process and come to terms with what's going on in any way imaginable. And after the weight had been lost, I ended up losing about 110 pounds, about 50 kilos in the
And
space of
what
about,
percentage of your body was that? That was like 40% of.
yes, 35 to 40%. At my heaviest, I was 137 kgs. That's 302 pounds. And I'd walked my way down to, which was 291 pounds. And then I went from 291 pounds to 180 pounds in 15 months. So that was about a 50 kg or 110 pound loss.
15 months. You probably
Yeah,
said that earlier, but it didn't click. You lost 110 pounds in 15 months.
100 of those pounds in 12 months.
Holy
But yeah,
smoke.
100 pounds in a year.
Were people saying you're sick? There's something wrong with you.
By the end, they were telling me to stop. They were worried I had some sort of disease that was going to send me too far in the other direction, or maybe it was because I was sort of showing some of these people up. At first, when people start to notice that you're visibly losing weight, everybody's really excited and happy. Oh, Brendan, you look great. You know what's going on, and that's awesome. But as I'm sort of approaching their weight and even getting smaller than they are, it sort of starts to go the other way, if anything. But, I can understand that. And I tell people, this is what I'm doing. You're free to give it a try. And it's really interesting when I put that idea to people, this is what I'm doing. You can give it a try if you like. People tend to respond in a number of different ways. There are people who are happy to give it a shot, no questions asked. They're happy that it's worked for me, and that's all the evidence that they need. There are people who have heard about this idea of low carb, but like myself, they'd also heard how it was always being shouted down and advised against, and so that it always made them a bit nervous. And so to have someone that they know who has made it work for them gives them a lot of confidence, even if they are aware of the wider advice. Then you've got people who hear about what I'm doing and they might think immediately, oh, but if that means I've got to go without my bread, I couldn't do it. I love my bread, or I love my pasta, or I love my this, that, or the next thing. Perhaps an element of addiction there. I don't know. That's not really my forte. But they decide on, I couldn't possibly do that. Even if it might work for them, they just can't convince themselves of that, which I can understand because I was there for so long myself. And then you've got the group of people who are almost insulted by the way that I've done it, because the first thought is, oh, that's not what they tell us, and that's not right, and you've lost weight wrong, they would say. You've gotten healthy wrong, or in spite of my success, it's dangerous and it's going to kill me, perhaps forgetting that at one point I practically had one foot in the grave anyway. I've been in and out of hospital all the time with chest pains and things. I remember talking to family from a hospital bed in the emergency department with these chest pains in 2009, and just letting them know, promise me you won't freak out, but I'm here and I've got these chest pains. And, anybody in that position knows what that means, right? This is not a good sign. But I remember being poked and prodded at that time at various tests and things. They found that my cholesterol wasn't really all that overly elevated. It was a little on the higher side, but nothing I would expected to have been concerned about had I not been so visibly in trouble. My blood sugar was seemingly okay. One thing that they did find was a problem, but they didn't actually tell me until I looked up my medical history years later, was that before I'd lost the weight, one of my problems physiologically, in addition to what was visibly going on, obviously, was that I was very chronically inflamed. So one marker that they did get a measure of, something called C-reactive protein, an inflammation marker. And depending on the unit of measure, whether it's the same in New Zealand as it is in the US or not. But basically, for those not familiar, CRP is a number where you want it to be low. The lower, the better. Single digits, obviously. 1 or 2 perhaps would be normal. At my highest, my CRP was something like 140. But that was something that nobody really pointed out or made known or explained to me what the problem was. That was really the only biomarker, if you like, that indicated to them that there was a problem. In addition to my weight, I was very inflamed, but all the other markers that they measured, blood sugar, blood pressure was fine. They all seemed to be fine. They didn't measure insulin. Nobody measured insulin. The trigs were, neither here nor there, but they never mentioned insulin. They saw that I was inflamed and that I was obviously very overweight. They prescribed ibuprofen and sent me on my way. And, that was one of the first things that I was pleased to be able to give up as I started losing the weight. I don't need these pills anymore, do I? Here's someone in their mid-30s taking ibuprofen for chest pain and thinking, okay, I can manage this until the ibuprofen runs out and then the pain comes back. And at that point, I realized, okay, the ibuprofen isn't actually treating anything. It's not treating root cause. It's just addressing the symptom. I was smart enough at least to understand that. And so that's why I kept looking for these dietary options and why I eventually was led to low carb. As far as my relationship with doctors and so on goes nowadays, and during the weight loss journey, my doctor at that time, I just had a change actually. Like I'd always gone to the same clinic, but the previous doc had moved on and this new guy came in just as I'd started low carbing. And he was a bit skeptical at first, but he could see that I was motivated. I had my own motivations for wanting to do this. And so he said, all right, we'll keep an eye on things. We'll do a few tests along the way and see how it goes. And, so I started getting some more blood work taken through him as I was losing the weight. My blood pressure was never all that high, but it was completely normal now. My blood glucose was never really all that high, but it was completely normal now. Same with my cholesterol in every respect. My triglycerides about halved, my HDL about doubled, but they did notice that my LDL had gone up, and there was a bit of concern about that. Oh, I don't know about that, but at the same time, my doc and I, we sort of weighed it all up. We thought, okay, LDL, which has this huge negative reputation about being the be all and end all for heart disease risk, etc. Yes, that's gone up, but at the same time, so many other things have gone in the direction that we want them to go. Blood sugars down, triglycerides down, HDL up, blood pressure normal, A1C normal. Inflammation was going right down. It was still about, 30 something in the first test while low carbing, but the next round of testing after that, it was down to single digits, completely normalized in the space of a year. And most importantly for me, myself, the patient, I'm looking so much better. I'm feeling so much better. The real world consequences far outweighed, in my mind, any concern about one number on a lab sheet compared to all of the other numbers that were also going in the direction that we all wanted. And ultimately, a year or two down the track, I get blood work sort of regularly even then. My LDL has since come back down anyway. So it only went up a reasonable amount while my body was adjusting, if you like, to this new way of eating, being in ketosis and so on, and this new way of metabolizing energy, burning fat instead of carbs. And once the body sort of adjusted to it, the LDL seems to have come back down. So it's really not much different now from what it was beforehand. All of these other markers, both on the lab sheet and the practical stuff, the real world stuff for me, was otherwise just resolved, relatively quickly in the space of just over a year. It boggles the mind, like you say, when you think about it.
And this is now how long ago since you lost all the weight?
So I started October 2015. I got to goal weight New Year's Eve 2016. So that's about 8 years ago now. So I've been more or less weight stable for about 8 years. I've since regained a little bit of it. I'll be back over 200 pounds or so now. But I've changed other things about my life since then as well. I'm now going to the gym. And learning to enjoy it. I'm putting on a little bit of muscle. I'm lifting a few weights here and there. I'm walking less because I used to walk to work and back every day with my old jobs. I was getting plenty of cardio, so very lean perhaps, in part for that reason. My new job now, I don't need to walk so much. So I'm walking less, but I'm lifting more. And so I like to think that the number on the scales has climbed up perhaps for good reasons, if anything, that the body composition might perhaps be a little bit better now. But broadly speaking, I've been weight stable now for 8 or 9 years.
Yeah. So then let's talk about, the motivation for writing the book and what you hope people will get from it. The good news, I guess I would say, is there are lots of people who have the same story as yours, right? And they've had great success with low carb diets. And the vast majority of them have not written books. And, maybe talk a little bit about why you kind of felt compelled to write the book and what you hope people could gain from the book.
Sure. Like I said, I began journaling early 2016 as the weight was starting to come off, and I'm starting to come to terms with the fact that, hey, this is happening. This is real, right? So a lot of processing of thoughts and ideas coming out through the journal. When I first started getting publicity through various websites online that publish my success story and so on, people start coming to me thinking, oh, maybe you should write a book about your story. And at first I thought, no way. That sounds like a lot of effort, right? And besides, books are for experts, for people who know things, for the doctors and the professors doctors and the scientists and the journalists of this world, what would be the value in a nobody like me, speaking my piece? But at the same time, I realized, in a sense, the target market would not be small. As you say, this is a problem shared by a great many people who could do with the help and could do with a bit of understanding that, hey, low carb is not necessarily the demon that has been made out to be in wider circles for quite some time. And so I started to consider the possibility, maybe I'll just keep journaling, but with the idea of a book one day in the back of my mind. Once I feel I've got enough, I've worked a few things out in my own time, just in my little journal to myself, and see where it goes. And so I started writing about 2018, I suppose, actively with the book in mind. And it ended up being something that was primarily just a personal weight loss story on its own. That was completed more or less by about the end of 2019. And I remember sort of going back over it thinking, okay, on its own, this is fine. This is a story, right? But I then sort of put myself in the minds of the readers, of the potential readers of the story. And I imagine that they might think, okay, this is a good story. He's done well for himself, good for him, etc. But then how would I know how applicable or transferable that this person's experience might be for me, the reader? And when I wondered about that, I thought, oh no, I'm going to have to do some research. I'm going to have to show some evidence, right? Because that's going to be the first criticism that people are going to come out with. This is just, it worked for him, sure, that's great, but he hasn't laid out the cards on the deck to say, here's the evidence to show that it could work for other people. And I realized I'd need to go to that level of trouble as well. And I'm not an academic by trade. At that time, I didn't have a degree. I do now, but I didn't back then. So I was completely new to the idea of what it was to do academic research, that sort of thing. But I figured out just enough. I knew enough about certain things like, appraising different types of scientific studies, right? Your randomized controlled trials are better than your observational studies, those sorts of things. I wanted to look at New Zealand data as much as possible. I mean, I know that the American market is that much larger and has a much larger profile, but I thought maybe I could carve a bit of a niche for myself in terms of coming at things from a New Zealand perspective. And what are the similarities and the differences, like we were talking about before, comparing the situation between New Zealand and the US. And so while the book is maybe 3/4 personal story on my part, which came fairly easily, the last quarter, if you like, of, I guess, what you might call investigative research, for lack of a better term, was much more difficult. That really challenged me, but in a good way, right? I learned a lot. I was able to put a lot of pieces of the puzzle that I had sort of stumbled upon over the years. I remember that Food for Health document back when I was a child, and I'd never really come back to it again until, writing the book and thinking about, how do these processes work? And what I'd learned was that New Zealand draws a lot of its nutrition policy from Australia and in particular the US. In the back of the book, I go through sort of an analysis from a layperson's perspective around, what are the potential issues around how the nutrition policy is put together. This is me again putting my problem-solving, technically minded IT type brain to work. I sort of thought to myself, if the dietary guidelines, they're a piece of policy, right? If the dietary guidelines were a piece of software, because I work with software in my day job for a living, what would happen if I tried to debug that software? I'm coming up with all of this evidence, these trials and studies that have been done that seem to indicate that low carb is a perfectly reasonable and perhaps the most effective option for weight loss, as well as a range of other metabolic issues, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on. But my focus was on weight loss, and I was finding all of these studies, yet I was also not seeing these studies necessarily being reflected in the policy. And so that's what I tried to explore in the back of the book. How is it that this low carb thing is not more widely known / understood / accepted than it currently is? And that was a really interesting exercise. I got fairly deeply embedded in the details of USDA evidence reviews from 2015, and then I repeated the process. I reanalyzed for 2020, and I found all sorts of really interesting technical little ways that seem to ensure that when you put it all together, a lot of that low carb evidence that you and I will know is out there, it exists, It's just not being recognized, not being reflected in the policy. And so you get concluding statements coming out of these evidence reviews saying that there is no evidence for low carb. It's easy to come to that conclusion, right? It's easy to come to that conclusion when, as one of the details of these evidence reviews, for example, they listed the keywords, that's the search keywords that they use when they go looking for the studies to incorporate into their reviews, right? And so amongst all those search keywords, you've got a lot of these other common dietary patterns: Mediterranean, DASH, low fat, low calorie, plant-based, and all these sorts of things. But no mention of low carb or keto or paleo. So of course your conclusion in your review is going to be there's no evidence that it's out there, when the mechanics of your review are set up in such a way that you don't even go looking for any of that evidence in the first place. That was one of the big issues I found with the 2015 USDA review. In 2020, yes, they started looking for low carb and keto a little bit more, but there were enough other issues in some of the downstream eligibility criteria that ensured, if you like, that the same end result was going to play out. Yes, there are now finding studies, but now for whatever technical reason, they don't count. Some examples of these would be, we're only interested in studies that look at diets characterized by food groups, right? So you think a Mediterranean diet, fruits, vegetables, grains, and so on and so forth. No problems there. But how might you characterize a low carb diet? A lot of the studies I was reading about tend to characterize it by the macronutrient distribution. So they would say, oh, a low carb diet is 20% carbs, right? Carbs aren't a food group, they're a nutrient. And so it's technicalities like those that say, oh, they weren't describing the foods themselves that the people on the low carb diet were eating. They were just tracking the energy, the macronutrient distribution as percentages of energy. And so that's a technicality that ensures that a lot of low carb studies don't count. Another one is that they're only interested effectively in studies on people who are already metabolically healthy. So if you're diagnosed with a disease, if you're hospitalized with any sort of condition or so on, then studies looking at these sorts of people who perhaps need the help the most, they don't count, because the scope of these guidelines are supposed to be all about prevention. Which on one hand, you might think that's okay, but then when you turn around and you see how these guidelines are being applied way beyond just the scope of prevention. You know, everybody says that the guidelines are the be all and end all for everybody, when in effect, they only look at studies on people who are already healthy. There's no guarantee that evidence base is going to be best for people who aren't healthy. What might be best for those people who aren't healthy? Let's look at the science that does the studies on people just like them who aren't healthy. What can diet do to treat these conditions as opposed to preventing them? And when you look at it from that perspective, you get a whole different bunch of evidence coming to light. But, you know, these are things that just don't see the light of day in those evidence reviews. And, you know, as influential as they are in the US, obviously, you then have countries like New Zealand, which don't even bother to do their own evidence reviews. We simply look to overseas reviews, such as those done in the US. So it's not just an American problem, it's a Western world problem. You know, it's the same thing in the UK, same thing in Australia, and so on and so forth. All roads seem to lead back to Washington in this regard. And what it's going to take for change, you know, most people say it's a bottom-up thing. That's not going to stop me from doing what I can, though, to address things from the top down. The book was the first step of that. I have other ideas for the future as well. I'm going to university next year for the first time in my life to study public health and see where that gets me. I have ideas for research projects and things I want to do in the future, and really do my part for helping to turn things around as best I can. Now that I've got myself sorted, you know, what else can I do to help other people? That's the next instinct I have. And, you know, watch this space.
Yeah, no, amazing. And I think I can't wait for people to, you know, get the book, read it. I think that's going to be fascinating for them. And, you know, I am optimistic, right, that we're starting to see this come into effect as we're recording this, you know, here in the last days of 2024, and we're less than 3 weeks from a change in our administration in the US. And one of the key talking points from the new administration is around health, and starting to talk about some of these concepts. Obviously, yet to be determined how that gets implemented and if it gets implemented, but at least it's being discussed at those levels, like you talked about. Very optimistic for that. I guess tell people again, I think the book tells very memorable, so they'll probably have remembered it from the beginning, but tell people where they can find it.
Sure. Yeah, the fatgingernerd.com is the website. There are links there to purchasing options, Amazon and all the other places. It's available as an ebook and a paperback. There's other socials as well. I'm on Facebook. I'm on X. I've got the beginnings of a YouTube channel. Just look for the Fat Ginger Nerd, basically, and chances are you'll find me.
The Fat Ginger Nerd, Brendan Reid. I want to have a deeper conversation with you that's not so much about metabolism and fat loss as it is about how you have changed internally. And really, I want to have the conversation with both of you guys. This is not the right podcast for it, so we'll just find another way to do it.
Maybe next time.
Maybe next.
Definitely.
This has been the Stay Off My Operating Table podcast with Dr. Philip Ovadia. We appreciate you being with us. Track down Brendan Reid at the Fat Ginger Nerd, and track down Dr. Philip Ovadia at ifixhearts.com. Thanks for being with us. We'll see y'all next time.
Chances are you wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you didn't need to change your life and get healthier. So take action right now. Book a call with Dr. Ovadia's team. One small step in the right direction is all it takes to get started. Contact us at ifixhearts.com/talk. That's ifixhearts.com/talk.